The wind carried dust down Main Street that morning, fine as ground corn and twice as stubborn. It clung to skirts, boots, and the bread loaves inside the basket Mara Linwood held against her hip. She stood where the boardwalk turned crooked before the Golden Spur Saloon, a spot that caught the foot traffic and the worst of the sun. Men came and went through the batwing doors, loud voices spilling whiskey and laughter into the street. They didn't look at her so much as look through her, like she was part of the dust. A few tossed coins if they felt generous, more often just words that weren't worth picking up. One man spat near her feet. "Bread stale as your luck, girl." She said nothing, only straightened her back. The bread was warm still. She'd risen before dawn to bake in the clay oven behind her shack at the edge of town. The loaf smelled faintly of rosemary and smoke, but out here, even good bread turned bitter fast. Across the street, behind a pane streaked with sunlight, Sheriff Calderhays watched her from his office window. His boots were crossed on the desk, hat tipped forward, but his eyes missed nothing. He'd seen her every day for near 3 months, standing in the heat or cold, never begging, never asking, selling bread to men who thought decency was a weakness. He knew her husband's name, Jeb Linwood, though he'd never met the man. Shot 2 years ago in a failed robbery south of Abilene. Folks said Mara had come here with nothing but that bread recipe and a mule too tired to stand. Rex Dalton, the man who owned the saloon, stepped outside then, thumbs hooked into his vest. His smile had the shape of cruelty. "You're on my boardwalk again, Miss Linwood." Her voice was quiet but steady. "Just till noon, Mr. Dalton. That's what you said last week." "I said till noon if you paid your rent." She reached for her apron pocket, counting out 3 small coins, thin, dirty, the kind that clinked like they were ashamed to be heard. He took them, weighed them in his palm, and tossed them into the dirt. "Next time it's 5, he said, turning back toward Saloon. "Price of doing business, in my shade." She bent to pick up the coins. Across the street, Sheriff Hayes muttered under his breath. His deputy, a freckled boy barely shaving, said, "She's trouble waiting to happen, Sheriff. You get mixed up in that town talk." Calder didn't answer. He just kept watching. Out here, law wasn't written in books. It was written in the eyes of whoever had the courage to hold a stare. By sundown, Mara's basket was empty. She packed what little remained of her pride and started the long walk home along the creek path. Behind her, laughter spilled again from the Golden Spur. One of the men called after her, "Next loaf's on credit, sweetheart." She didn't look back. That night, when the lamps were low and the coyotes called, Sheriff Hayes sat on his porch with a cigar that had gone out twice. He could still see her in his mind, barefoot, dust on her skirt hem, chin high, the kind of courage that didn't make noise but still shook the ground. He flicked the cigar into the dirt and said softly, "Damn this town." Mara woke before dawn. Her shack leaned against a dying cottonwood tree, boards patched with scrap metal, roof held by hope and 2 nails. She lit the stove, kneaded dough with hands that trembled from the night chill, and thought about leaving. There was a train north come Friday. If she could sell 10 loaves each day till then, she might afford a ticket. Just her and the little tin cross she'd kept from Jeb's belongings. When she walked into town, the sky was pale blue, the kind that pretended peace before the heat hit. She set her stand again by the saloon. Some men nodded in greeting. Most ignored her. A young ranch hand named Eli stopped by, a shy grin under his hat brim. He bought a loaf warm from the basket and said, "Ma'am, you ought to stay clear of this side of town. Dalton's boy's been drinking me lately." She smiled faintly. "Means not new to me." He looked like he wanted to say more, but just touched his hat brim and walked off toward the stables. By mid-morning, the saloon doors swung wide and 3 men stumbled out, laughing. Mara froze when they stopped in front of her stand. "Bread girl." One of them said, "Breath sour with whiskey. Let's see what you got." He snatched a loaf, tore it in half, and tossed a piece at his friend. They laughed, cramming it into their mouths. Another man reached for her basket. When she tried to pull it back, he shoved her shoulder. "Sweet little baker thinks she's better than us." The basket hit the ground, bread scattering into the dust. Mara didn't cry. She just stood there, heart pounding like a drum in her chest. The laughter cut sharp through the morning air. Then the sound changed, the soft creak of spurs on wood. Sheriff Hayes was crossing the street. He didn't shout or reach for his gun. He just stopped beside Mara, eyes cold as iron, and said, "Pick up your mess, boys." They hesitated, but his tone left no room. Slowly muttering, they gathered the torn bread and set it back in her basket. Rex Dalton appeared in the doorway, arms folded, smirking. "Now, Sheriff, no need to start seeing. Boys just playing." Calder looked at him, steady and hard. "You keep your boys leash, Dalton." Dalton's smile twitched. "Ain't my job to protect every stray that wanders into town? Maybe it's mine." For a long moment, the two men just stared. Then the sheriff turned and walked back across the street. Mara stood frozen, still clutching the basket. She wanted to thank him, but the words caught somewhere between pride and fear. That night, someone broke into her shack. They didn't steal much. There wasn't anything worth taking, but they smashed the baking pans, scattered flour, and burned the Bible that had belonged to her husband. When the smoke cleared, she sat among the ashes, whispering a prayer that sounded more like surrender. At sunrise, she walked barefoot to the sheriff's office. He looked up from his desk when she stepped in, eyes widening slightly at the sight of her, hair unbound, soot on her arms, her voice shaking. "They burned my home," she said. "I just wanted to tell you." He stood, hat in hand. "You know who did it?" She shook her head. "Don't matter. I'm leaving soon anyway." He walked around the desk, stopping a few feet from her. "Where will you go?" "Anywhere but here." Outside, the town was waking, hammer on metal, horses snorting, boots striking boards. But inside, the air hung still. Calder said, "I'll look into it." She turned to leave. Then crack. A gunshot split the air. The bullet struck the dirt near her feet, dust flying up around her toes. She froze. Across the street, a shadow leaned on the saloon rail, lowering a rifle. The sheriff's hand went to his holster, but by the time he looked again, the man was gone. Mara's breath came fast, eyes wide. Calder stepped between her and the street. "Go home," he said quietly, "and keep your head down." She nodded, barefoot on the warm planks, walking away without looking back. The sheriff stood there long after she disappeared around the corner, watching the dust settle where the bullet had hit. That evening the horizon burned gold, but it wasn't the sun doing the burning. Mara saw the smoke first, a thin gray ribbon rising over Creek Bend. Her heart dropped. She ran, skirt catching briars, lungs tight, until the smell hit her, sharp, black, final. Her shack was aflame. The fire crackled through the boards, greedy and loud. She tried to rush in, but the heat drove her back. The oven she'd built was already crumbling, flames licking the iron pot she used for dough. She screamed once, a sound swallowed by the roar. Then strong hands pulled her back. Sheriff Hayes dragged her clear of the smoke, coughing hard. "You out of your mind," he barked. "My tools, my pans." "They're gone, Mara," he shouted, voice rough. "Ain't nothing left in there worth dying for." She fell to her knees, trembling, face streaked with soot. The sheriff's jaw tightened as he turned toward town. "Dalton," he said under his breath, like the name itself was a curse. She wiped her eyes. "He'll kill you if you go there." "Maybe," he said, "but someone's got to remind that bastard where the line is." He stepped closer to her, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "You got anywhere else to go?" "No." He nodded once. "Then you ain't going nowhere tonight. You'll stay in my office till we sort this out." "I can't." "You can," he said firmly. "That's law enough." She stared at him, searching for mockery and finding none. For the first time in years, she wasn't invisible. They stood together as the flames died down, the last boards collapsing into glowing ash. Behind them, the night spread over prairie, quiet, wide, uncaring. Calder rested a hand on the butt of his revolver and looked toward the saloon's flickering lights across the dark. His voice was low, almost to himself. "You're not leaving town," he said. "Not alone, anyway." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke and bread long turned to cinder. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, lonely as the law itself. And in that small town of Dry Creek, something unseen began to change, the line between duty and decency, between law and what was right. By dawn, smoke still hung over the ashes of Mara's shack, curling thin and ghostly against the pale sky. Sheriff Calder Hayes had spent most of the night pacing between his office and ruin. The smell of char still caught in his clothes. He hadn't slept, and neither had she. When morning light struck the town's single street, Mara was already there again, barefoot, basket freshly filled. Every loaf had been baked in the sheriff's backroom oven. She'd borrowed the tin pans, scrubbed the table clean, and refused his offer to rest. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked, leaning in the doorway, hat low. Her eyes were hollow but steady. "If I don't sell, I don't eat. Fire didn't change that." He studied her for a moment, then crossed the street with her. The townsfolk watched, storekeepers, ranch hands, a few women hanging laundry on lines that creaked in the dry wind. When Mara stopped at the Golden Spurs porch, every man inside turned to look. Dalton leaned in the doorway again, a cigar between his teeth, grinned sharp as a blade. "Well now," he said, "bread girl's got nerve. Maybe too much." Calder stepped up beside her. His voice was calm, but it carried down the street like thunder waiting to break. "She's under my protection now." The words dropped into silence. Even the horses tied out front seemed to still. Dalton's smile faltered, just a flicker, before returning. "You can't protect everyone, Sheriff. Law don't stretch that thin." "It stretches far enough," Calder said. He turned to men at the tables. "Anyone bothers her again answers to me." No one spoke. The sheriff turned on his heel and walked back across the street. Mara stood frozen, the echo of his words ringing louder than gunfire. For the first time, the men in the saloon looked at her differently. Not with pity or mockery, but with the uneasy respect that comes when someone important takes a stand. That afternoon, she sold every loaf. When the last coin hit her palm, she looked toward the sheriff's office. He was sitting on the porch rail, one boot hooked around a post, head bowed as if half asleep. But she knew he wasn't. And somewhere in her chest, something quiet began to thaw. That night, as she left a loaf at his door, still warm, wrapped in cloth, she whispered, "Thank you," though he'd never hear it. 2 days passed before the whispering began. It started small, carried by merchants and drunkards alike. "Sheriff's keeping the bread woman in his bed. She burned her own house for pity." Dalton says the sheriff's got soft. By the third morning, half the town looked away when Mara walked past. Some crossed the street. Others spat near her boots, just to see if she'd react. In the saloon, laughter rose sharp and mean. "Hayes is making himself a hero," someone said. "Can't wait to see how that ends." The sheriff heard every word. He ignored most of them. But one afternoon, when his deputy, young Tom Finch, came running in pale face, he knew it had gone too far. "Sheriff," Tom said, pointing toward the window, "you better look." Scratched deep into the glass of the front window were the words, "Bread whore." The letters glinted cruelly in the sunlight. Calder stood there a long time, jaw tight, fingers flexing near his revolver. "You see who did it?" Tom shook his head. "Likely Dalton's men." The sheriff exhaled slowly. "Get a cloth. Clean it off." Tom hesitated. "Sheriff, you can't." "Clean it off," Calder said again, quieter this time, but with that tone that made men obey. By sundown, the glass was clear again, but the damage had spread. Folks stopped visiting the jail. Merchants refused his handshake, and the churchman crossed the street when he saw Mara walking beside him. Still she baked. Still she sold. One night, Mara carried a fresh loaf to the sheriff's porch. He was sitting outside, cleaning his revolver under the lamplight. "I shouldn't bring this," she said softly, setting on the step. He looked up. "Why not? They'll talk more." "They'll talk either way." She smiled a little, weary but real. "You ever get tired of fighting for people who don't want you to?" "Every day," he said. Then, softer, "But I fight anyway." Thunder rumbled far off, the kind that promised rain, but might never come. She lingered a moment longer, then turned to go. Behind them, unseen in the shadows, a figure leaned against the livery wall, watching. Dalton's man, the scarred one they called Pike. His grin caught the lamplight. Before dawn, Pike brought the news back to Saloon. "Sheriff's got himself a pet," he said. "They eat together now." Dalton's face hardened. Then it's time to remind him who runs this town. That night, the saloon lights burned later than usual. 6 men rode out at midnight. Drunk and mean, laughter echoing down the dark road. The sheriff had just started to doze when the first shot shattered the quiet. The first bullet hit the sign above the sheriff's office, splintering the wood. The second tore through the front window, scattering glass over the desk. "Down!" Calder barked, pushing Mara behind the heavy oak cabinet. Tom Finch stumbled from his cot, clutching his rifle. "They're coming from the saloon, Sheriff." "Keep your head low," Calder said, sliding to the doorway. "And don't fire till I say." The sound outside was chaos. Hoofs pounding, drunken shouting, the dull crack of gun smoke rolling through the street. "Hayes!" Dalton's voice roared over the din. "You think you can play God in my town? Come out and meet your judgment." Calder pressed his back to the wall, revolver steady in his hand. Mara crouched behind the desk, heart hammering. She could hear boots scuffing outside, see flashes of light through the bullet holes. Tom's hands shook as he reloaded. "There's too many of them, Sheriff." "Then we make every bullet count." The next shot shattered a lantern. Firelight flickered across the floor. Calder fired back, once, twice. A scream answered him. Then a body thudded against the porch rail. "Stay down," he shouted to Mara. She crawled closer, grabbed a handful of cartridges from the drawer, and slid them across the floor toward him. "You'll run dry," she said, voice tight with fear. "I won't," he said, but he took them anyway. The street outside exploded again, more gunfire, horses rearing, men cursing. Rain began to fall, sudden and hard, hissing on the roofs. Through the downpour, Calder glimpsed Dalton standing on the saloon balcony, soaked but smiling, holding a rifle. "End this." Dalton shouted, "Give me the girl," and we walk away. Calder leaned into the doorway, rain dripping from his hat brim. "You'll have to walk over me first." Dalton fired. The bullet missed by inches, splintering the doorframe. Calder's return shot hit true. Dalton's rifle spun from his hands, clattering into the street. The men below cursed and scattered. Tom cried out suddenly, clutching his arm, blood seeping between his fingers. Mara crawled to him, pressing a rag tight over the wound. "Stay still," she whispered. He groaned, teeth clenched. Ain't bad, ma'am." Outside, thunder crashed again, louder than before. The fight went on. Another bullet smashed through the window. Calder fired back, each shot quick, deliberate. One man went down. Another stumbled away limping. At last, silence crept in, broken only by rain tapping on tin roofs and the sheriff's ragged breathing. He stepped outside slowly, revolver still raised. 2 bodies lay in the street. The others were gone, their horses pounding into the night. On the saloon porch, Dalton stood drenched, face pale but unbroken. "You just bought yourself a war, Sheriff," he called. Calder holstered his gun. "Then make sure you bring enough men next time." He turned back toward his office. Mara was at the doorway, eyes wide, hair plastered her face from the rain. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "You all right?" She nodded slowly. "I should be asking you that." He looked past her to where Tom lay, pale but breathing. "Get him bandaged. I'll stand watch." Mara hesitated. "They won't stop." "No," he said quietly. "They won't." She wanted to say something about fear or gratitude or the strange way courage feels when it's shared. But the words wouldn't come. He took his hat off, rain dripping from its brim, and said, almost himself, "Town's watching now. We either finish this or get swallowed whole." Across the street, curtains fluttered as townsfolk peeked from their windows. Nobody came out to help. Nobody said a word. The rain kept falling, washing blood and dust alike into the gutter. Later, as Calder stood beneath the office porch, rifle across his arm, he glanced toward the saloon again. Dalton was gone, but the lamplight inside still burned. Mara stepped beside him, wrapping a shawl over her shoulders. "You can't fight the whole town, Sheriff." He looked at her, eyes dark and tired. "I ain't fighting the town." He paused, voice low. "I'm fighting what it's become." The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. Two people who'd lost everything but hadn't lost themselves. When she finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "You saved my life." He shook his head. "You saved your own. I just gave you time to do it." She smiled faintly. "Then I'll keep it keen." He almost smiled back. "Good. The town could use something decent." As the rain eased, the first light of dawn crept over the rooftops. Smoke rose from the saloon chimney, faint and slow, like the breath of a beast not yet slain. And on that street of mud and silence, the sheriff's words still echoed, even after the gunfire faded. "She's under my protection now." But both of them knew what that meant. Protection wasn't peace. It was a promise, and promises in Dry Creek had a price. Dawn came slow over the valley, dragging a pale light through the dust that still hung above Dawson's Main Street. The saloon doors creaked on their hinges, one nearly torn off. Spent shells glinted in the dirt like dull brass beads. A stray dog sniffed at a broken hat and slunk away. Maria stood where her stall used to be, or what was left of it. The little table was splintered. The bread baskets were riddled with holes, one still stained from the night's blood. The morning wind carried a faint smell of burnt gunpowder, and behind it, the sharper scent of whiskey and regret. She was still wearing the same torn shawl. Her hair hung loose now, dark against the pale morning. She didn't move much, just stared at the saloon, her lips pressed tight. The sheriff came up behind her, quiet as a ghost. His hat was off, and his arm was in a makeshift sling. The wound from the gunfight had bled through the bandage. His face was gray with exhaustion, and there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You shouldn't be out here yet," he said. "I've been out here every morning since I came to this town," she answered. "Just seems I got nothing left to sell now." He looked around the street, at the boarded windows, the men sweeping up glass, the women whispering at doorways. Dawson looked smaller somehow, after the smoke cleared. "You sold more than bread, Maria," he said finally. "You gave this place something decent. That's rare here." Her eyes flicked toward him, uncertain. "And what do I give you, Sheriff?" He didn't answer. Not right away. The question cut too deep, and he didn't have the right to soften it. He just looked down the street, toward the gallows at the edge of town, where 3 bodies hung, the ones who hadn't made it out of the gunfight. "You gave me a reason to stand my ground," he said at last. They stood in silence, the wind brushing dust over their boots. The undertaker's wagon rolled past. The driver tipped his hat. Maria's gaze followed it, then dropped to her hands. She had burned them the night before when a lantern shattered near the stall, but she hadn't noticed until dawn. The skin was red and raw. The sheriff saw it and frowned. "You need sal for that." "I've had worse," she said. "Back when I was running from El Paso. The road don't forgive either." He studied her, seeing for the first time the wear that no bullet could cause, the kind carved by miles, by hunger, by being alone too long. Then he said something he hadn't planned to. "You don't have to keep running anymore." Her eyes met his dark, searching, almost frightened. "And what if trouble follows me?" "It usually does." "Then it'll have to deal with me first." She almost smiled then, but the weight of the night hadn't left her shoulders. Behind them, the church bell tolled once, deep and hollow. "Burial's at noon," the sheriff murmured. "Then I'll be riding out after the rest of Carter's gang, the one who got away." Her throat tightened. "You'll go alone?" He adjusted his hat, his jaw set. "Always have." "And if you don't come back?" He turned to her fully now, his eyes steady. "Then I expect you to keep selling bread. And to remember what I said, you're under my protection, whether I'm standing here or not." The words hit her harder than gunfire. She looked away, blinking against the wind. "You talk like a man already halfway gone." He didn't answer. He just stepped closer, brushed a bit of dust from her shoulder, and said softly, "Stay in town till I get back. That's an order." Then he turned and walked down the main street. Slow, deliberate, the way men walk when they've already made peace with whatever waits out there. Maria watched until he was gone. Then she whispered to the empty street, "Don't make me lose another man to this dust." But the only thing that answered was the creak of the sign above the saloon, swaying in the wind. The sun was sinking behind the ridge when Maria heard the first distant echo of gunfire again. She was standing outside the church, helping the preacher's wife sweep away the dust after the burial service, when the sound rolled down from the hills, sharp, flat, unmistakable. Her heart seized. She didn't even think. She dropped the broom, tore off her shawl, and ran. The townsfolk shouted after her, but their voices blurred behind the pounding in her chest. She ran past the corral, past the dry creek bed, until the roofs of Dawson shrank to dust behind her. She didn't have a horse, only her boots and stubborn will. The ridge wasn't far, but every step felt like a mile. Her breath burned her throat. The air smelled of iron and smoke. When she reached the top, she froze. Below, in a narrow gully, the sheriff's horse was down, still kicking weakly in the dust. The sheriff himself was behind a boulder, firing at 3 riders closing in from south. Carter's men, the ones that got away. Maria's first thought wasn't fear. It was anger. He told her to stay behind. He told her not to follow. But she'd buried too many good men to watch another die out here. She slid down the ridge, the rocks cutting her palms, the sound of her breath harsh in the silence between shots. She reached the dying horse, grabbed the rifle from its saddle, and crawled toward the sheriff. He turned just as she dropped beside him. His eyes widened. "What the hell?" "Save your breath," she snapped. "I'm here now." He was bleeding again, a line of red along his ribs. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have gone alone." Then came another shot, close. The rock above them shattered. Dust rained down. The sheriff chambered a round, fired, and one of the riders tumbled from his horse. 2 left. The sound of the horses echoed off the hills, thundering like drums. Maria took aim, her hands trembling. The recoil hit her hard, but she held her ground. Another man fell. The last one turned his horse, heading for the ridge. The sheriff stood, staggered, and leveled his revolver. Click. Empty. Maria raised the rifle again. But the last man was too far, fading into the sun. Then the sheriff did something she didn't expect. He didn't shoot. He just lowered his hand. Let him go. She stared at him. He'll come back. I know. He sank to one knee, grimacing in pain. Help me up. She did, sliding an arm under his shoulder. Together they climbed the ridge, every step dragging. The world seemed to go quiet, save for their breathing and the rasp of boots on stone. When they reached the top, the valley opened before them, endless plains bathed in dying light. Maria looked at him, saw the blood soaking through his shirt, and whispered, "You can't ride like this." "I can," he said, but his voice was weak. "No, not today." He sat down heavily, the rifle across his knees. For a long moment, neither spoke. The light turned red, then gold, then pale as the sun slipped behind the hills. Maria finally said, "You risked your life for people who'd never risk theirs for you. Why?" He stared at the horizon, his face unreadable. "Because someone has to stand between what's right and what's easy. And what if it kills you?" He turned to her then, his eyes meeting hers, steady and soft. "Then I die knowing you're safe." Her throat tightened. "You keep saying that like I'm yours to protect." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." The silence that followed was long and heavy, the kind that says more than words ever could. Then from the ridge below came a faint sound, the echo of hooves again. Maria stood, rifle in hand. "He's coming back." The sheriff pushed his feet, steadying himself. "Then we finish this." They stood side by side as a lone rider appeared again, black against the burning sky. He fired once. The bullet struck the stone near Maria's feet. She didn't flinch. She lifted the rifle, aimed slow, and fired. The shot echoed through the valley. The rider fell. Silence returned. For a long time, neither of them moved. The sun dipped lower, the light fading from the world. Then Maria turned to him. "It's over," she said quietly. He nodded, breathing hard. For now. They made their way back to town long after dark, walking side by side to the desert wind. When they reached Dawson, the lamps were lit. The people waiting at the edge of town fell silent. Maria helped him up the saloon steps, into the light. He looked at the crowd, his voice steady despite the pain. "Nobody touches her. Nobody threatens her. Not ever again. She's under my protection, and that means she's under this town's too." No one spoke, but the meaning settled like stone. He turned to her then, his eyes soft. "You still want cell bread out here?" She smiled, small, weary, but real. "Maybe tomorrow." And when dawn came again, Dawson felt different. The saloon still stood. The wind still blew. But people looked at her stall not as a curiosity, as something that belonged. The sheriff sat outside, arms still in a sling, watching her sell her first loaf of the day. And when their eyes met, there was something quiet and certain between them, the kind of promise the West rarely allowed, but sometimes, if you were lucky, kept.